On Maple Street, there were two men everyone talked about. The first was David. David drove a black luxury SUV. He wore expensive watches. He loved talking about business, investments, and success. Whenever neighbors gathered, David was usually the center of attention. People admired him. Many wished they had his lifestyle. The second man was Robert. Most people barely noticed him. He lived in a modest house, drove an old blue sedan, and rarely talked about money. If you had asked anyone on Maple Street who was more successful, almost everyone would have pointed to David without hesitation, and they all would have been wrong. Every morning at exactly 6:15, Robert left his house carrying a simple lunch bag. He would wave to neighbors, get into his aging sedan, and drive to work. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. Nothing about him suggested wealth. That was exactly how Robert wanted it. One Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood organized a barbecue. Children played in the yard. Music drifted through the air. Groups of neighbors stood around discussing work, travel, and recent purchases. David quickly became the center of the conversation. He showed photos of a kitchen renovation that had cost tens of thousands of dollars. Then he talked about an upcoming luxury vacation. People listened with interest. Several neighbors congratulated him. Eventually, David noticed Robert standing nearby. He smiled. "Robert," he said, "when are you finally going to replace that old car?" The group laughed. Robert glanced toward the street where his sedan was parked. Then he smiled. "Probably not any time soon." David shook his head. "If I had your money, I'd enjoy life a little more." The laughter grew louder. Robert simply nodded, because there was something nobody at that barbecue knew, something that would have shocked every person standing there. Robert could have purchased every vehicle on that street with cash. Not just David's SUV, every vehicle, but nobody knew it. Because Robert had spent years learning a lesson most people never learn. To understand that lesson, we need to go back more than 30 years. Back to a small house on the edge of town. Back to when Robert was 15 years old. His family wasn't poor, but they were always struggling. Every month felt like a race against bills. His father worked long hours at a manufacturing plant. His mother worked part-time at a grocery store. Yet money always seemed to disappear. One winter evening, Robert sat quietly at the kitchen table while his parents reviewed their bills. The heating system needed repairs. The car needed repairs. And Christmas was only a few weeks away. His father rubbed his forehead in frustration. His mother stared silently at the stack of envelopes. Neither of them knew how they were going to make everything work. For the first time, Robert saw fear in his father's eyes. Not fear of hard work. His father had always worked hard. It was fear of never getting ahead. Fear of spending an entire lifetime working and still worrying about money. That image stayed with Robert. Years later, he would still remember that moment. The silence, the stress, the feeling of being trapped. That night, lying in bed, Robert made a promise to himself. One day he would break the cycle. One day money would stop controlling his life. The problem was that he had no idea how. Years passed. After graduating, Robert got his first full-time job. The paycheck wasn't impressive, but it was enough to live on. Like many young workers, he was excited when he received his first paycheck. He immediately started thinking about what he could buy: a better stereo, new clothes, maybe even a newer car. Then one afternoon during lunch break, something happened that changed his life forever. An older employee named Mr. Anderson sat across from him in the company cafeteria. Mr. Anderson was approaching retirement. Unlike everyone else at work, he never seemed stressed. He never complained about money, never worried about overtime, and never panicked when unexpected expenses appeared. Curious, Robert finally asked him a question. "How are you always so calm?" Mr. Anderson smiled, then reached into his wallet. From inside, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. The paper looked old and worn. "What is that?" Robert asked. "My financial plan," Mr. Anderson replied. Robert laughed. "That's your entire plan?" Mr. Anderson nodded, then unfolded the paper. At the top were 4 simple words. "Pay yourself first." Robert looked confused. Mr. Anderson leaned forward. "Most people spend first and save what's left." He paused. "Successful people save first and spend what's left." For a moment, Robert said nothing. The idea sounded almost too simple, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Before leaving the cafeteria, Mr. Anderson gave him one final piece of advice. Small amounts invested consistently will beat big promises and quick money schemes every time. Robert never forgot those words. That evening he went home and made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his life. From that day forward, every paycheck would follow the same rule. Before spending money on anything else, he would invest a portion of it. No excuses, no exceptions, and although he didn't realize it yet, that simple habit would eventually make him a millionaire. Part 2. Building Wealth in Silence. At first, nothing seemed different. Robert followed the rule every payday. Invest first, spend the rest, then repeat. The amounts weren't impressive. Sometimes it was only a small percentage of his paycheck, but he stayed consistent. Months passed, then years, and honestly, there were moments when Robert wondered if he was wasting his time. One Friday evening, several co-workers invited him to dinner after work. The restaurant was crowded, the atmosphere was lively, and as often happens, the conversation turned to money. One co-worker had just bought a new sports car, another was planning a luxury vacation, a third had financed a larger apartment. Everyone seemed excited, everyone seemed successful. Then someone looked at Robert. "What about you? What are you doing with your money?" Robert shrugged. "I invest part of every paycheck." The table went silent. Then came the laughter. "You're saving for retirement already. We're still young. Enjoy life while you can." Even Robert laughed. But later that night, driving home in his old sedan, those words stayed in his mind. Part of him wanted the sports car. Part of him wanted the attention. Part of him wanted to stop being different. But another part of him remembered his parents sitting at the kitchen table, worrying about bills. And that memory was stronger. The next morning, he made his investment exactly as planned. Years passed. The routine never changed. Then Robert met Emily. They met at a friend's birthday party. While everyone else was talking about jobs and possessions, Emily was talking about goals, dreams, travel, freedom. The conversation lasted for hours. Before the evening ended, Robert knew she was different. Several months later, during one of their dates, he decided to tell her about his financial plan. He expected her to find it boring. Instead, she smiled. "You mean you're building your future?" Robert laughed. "I guess that's one way to put it." Emily nodded. "Good. Most people spend years trying to look successful. I'd rather actually be successful." That was the moment Robert realized he had found the right person. A few years later, they got married. As their careers improved, their income increased. And with every raise came a choice: spend more or invest more. Again and again, they chose investing, not because they hated spending money, Not because they wanted to live like misers, but because they understood something most people ignore. Every dollar has a job. You can spend it today, or you can give it a chance to work for you tomorrow. Meanwhile, life on Maple Street continued. Neighbors upgraded homes, friends bought luxury vehicles, co-workers chased bigger lifestyles, and sometimes Robert wondered if they were right. Then something happened that changed everything. One Saturday morning, Robert opened his investment account. At first he thought there was a mistake. The balance looked different, much different. For years, growth had been almost invisible, but now the numbers were moving faster. The investments he made years earlier were generating returns. Those returns were creating new returns, and those returns were creating even more growth. For the first time, Robert wasn't just earning money from his job. His money was beginning to earn money on its own. That evening, he showed the account to Emily. She stared at the screen, then looked at him, then back at the screen. "It works," she said quietly. Robert smiled. "It really does." Neither of them celebrated. There were no parties, no expensive purchases, just a quiet understanding that their patience was beginning to pay off. But life has a way of testing people, and just when everything seemed to be moving in the right direction, the economy began showing signs of trouble. Businesses slowed, investors grew nervous. Financial headlines became increasingly negative. Most people ignored the warnings. Others became afraid. Nobody knew it yet, but one of the biggest financial storms in decades was about to arrive. And when it did, everything Robert believed would be tested. Part 3. The Crisis. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. Within months, the economy began slowing down. Businesses cut jobs, companies reduced spending, and financial markets started falling. At first, most investors remained calm. Market declines had happened before. People assumed things would quickly recover. But this time felt different. The losses continued, week after week, month after month. Fear spread everywhere. One morning, Robert opened his investment account before leaving for work. The numbers were painful to look at. Years of gains had disappeared. On paper, it looked like a disaster. For a moment, he sat quietly at the kitchen table, coffee in one hand, laptop open in front of him, wondering what to do next. Across the street, David was facing the same problem, but David handled it differently. Every morning started with financial news. Every evening ended with financial news. The more he watched, the more worried he became. Every headline predicted disaster. Every expert seemed uncertain. Every day brought more reasons to panic. Eventually, fear won. One afternoon, David sold most of his investments. The moment he clicked the button, he felt relief. The anxiety disappeared, at least temporarily. That evening, he told several neighbors, "I got out before things became worse." Many agreed with him. Some even followed his example. But Robert didn't. Despite the fear, despite the losses, despite the uncertainty, he continued investing every month, exactly as before. Not because he enjoyed seeing his account decline, not because he knew exactly what would happen next, but because he trusted the plan he had followed for years. One evening, Emily noticed he was unusually quiet. "Are you worried?" she asked. Robert looked at the screen, then nodded. "A little." Emily smiled. "Good." Robert looked confused. "Good?" she laughed. "If you're not worried during times like this, you're not paying attention." Then she placed her hand on his. "But we followed the same plan for years. Why stop now?" Robert smiled, because she was right. Their strategy had never been based on emotions. It had been based on patience, so they stayed the course. Months passed. Then one evening, there was a knock at the front door. When Robert opened it, he found David standing outside. For the first time in years, David looked defeated. The confidence was gone. The excitement was gone. Even his voice sounded different. "Can we talk?" he asked. A few minutes later, the two men sat together in the backyard. The sun was beginning to set. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, David broke the silence. "I sold everything." Robert nodded. "I know." David looked down. "I couldn't handle it anymore." Then he asked the question that had been bothering him for months. "How do you stay calm?" Robert looked across the yard. Near the fence stood a large oak tree. Its branches stretched high above them, strong, steady, unmoving. Robert pointed toward it. "See that tree?" David nodded. "I planted it 25 years ago." David looked surprised. "Really?" Robert smiled. "It was smaller than my knee." For a moment, both men looked at the tree. Then Robert continued. "Nobody noticed it growing. Not the first year, not the 5th year, not even the 10th. But it kept growing, a little at a time, every year." David remained silent. "The biggest financial victories work the same way," Robert said. "Most people want immediate results. They want to see progress right away. But wealth grows quietly. So quietly that most people give up before they see it." David stared at the tree, and for the first time, something clicked. The lesson wasn't about investing. The lesson was about patience. Months later, the market finally began recovering. Then it recovered faster than anyone expected. The investments Robert had continued buying during the downturn increased dramatically. Meanwhile, David watched from the sidelines. The assets he had sold were rising in value again. The difference between the two men wasn't intelligence. It wasn't luck. It was discipline. And discipline had just changed everything. But the biggest surprise was still ahead, because the people of Maple Street were about to discover a secret Robert had been building for decades. Part 4. The Millionaire Next Door. The years passed. The crisis became a memory. The economy recovered. Markets reached new highs. And life on Maple Street returned to normal. Children grew up. Families moved away. New neighbors arrived. But Robert's routine never changed. He continued investing, month after month, year after year, without excitement, without shortcuts, without trying to get rich quickly. Eventually, something remarkable happened. Robert reached retirement age. On his final day of work, there was no grand celebration, no luxury car waiting outside, no dramatic announcement, just handshakes from co-workers and a quiet drive home. That evening, Emily prepared his favorite dinner. As they sat together, she raised her glass. To freedom. Robert smiled. For decades, they had worked toward this moment, not to become famous, not to impress anyone, but to have control over their time. And now, they finally had it. For the first time in his life, Robert didn't need a paycheck. His investments were producing enough income to support their lifestyle. The freedom he had dreamed about as a teenager had finally arrived. Years later, life delivered a challenge neither of them expected. Emily became ill. The diagnosis came suddenly. The months that followed were difficult. Doctors, treatments, hospital visits, long nights. For Robert, it was one of the hardest periods of his life. Money couldn't remove the pain. It couldn't stop time. It couldn't change the outcome. But it did remove one burden. He never had to worry about paying the bills, never had to choose between treatment and finances, never had to wonder how he would survive. The financial foundation they had built together protected them when they needed it most. Eventually, Emily passed away. The house felt quieter afterward. The days felt longer. And for a while, Robert struggled with the loneliness. But he remained grateful. Grateful for the years they shared, and grateful for the choices they had made together. As time passed, Robert became known as the quiet, older man on Maple Street. Most neighbors still knew very little about him. They saw the same modest house, the same practical lifestyle, the same ordinary routines. What they didn't see was the result of 40 years of disciplined investing. Then one day, everything changed. A financial advisor visited Robert's home to help organize part of his estate. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People became curious. Questions turned into rumors. Rumors turned into conversations. And eventually the truth came out. Robert's investment portfolio was worth several $1 million. Millions. The news shocked everyone. Neighbors could hardly believe it. The man they had ignored for decades was the wealthiest person on the street. Not David. Not the people with luxury cars. Not the people with the biggest houses. Robert. The quiet man with the old sedan. A few days later, David walked across the street and knocked on Robert's door. When Robert opened it, David laughed. "You know, I never saw it coming." Robert smiled. Neither did most people. The two men sat on the porch as the sun began to set. Just like they had many times before, except this conversation felt different. David looked out toward the street, then shook his head. "I spent years trying to look wealthy." He paused. "And you spent years becoming wealthy." Robert smiled, because David was finally seeing the difference. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Then David asked one final question. "When did you know you were going to become a millionaire?" Robert thought about it carefully. Then he answered, "I didn't." David looked surprised. Robert continued, "I never focused on becoming a millionaire. I focused on making good decisions. Again and again. Year after year. That's all." David nodded slowly, because suddenly everything made sense. There had been no secret investment, no winning lottery ticket, no miracle opportunity. Just patience, discipline, and time. Thousands of ordinary decisions repeated over decades. And together, those decisions created an extraordinary result. That may be the most important lesson of this story. Most people want dramatic changes, but wealth is usually built quietly. One investment, one paycheck, one good decision at a time. Robert never became wealthy because he earned the highest salary. He never became wealthy because he was lucky, and he never became wealthy because he was smarter than everyone else. He became wealthy because he stayed consistent when others quit. While others chased appearances, he built freedom. While others spent first, he invested first. While others wanted to look rich, he focused on becoming rich. And in the end, that made all the difference. Thank you for watching Money Road. If you enjoyed this story and want more lessons about wealth, investing, and financial freedom, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Because the road to wealth isn't built overnight, it's built one smart decision at a time, and we'll see you in the next video.